iPods on or anything. Okay, thank you, totally appreciate it. Just want to introduce you to Carl. I've known this fellow for quite a few years. He did say he has a lot of things that he does, but his basic focus is he's really interested in how to make our society transition into from a society that's really consuming more than it can beyond its means, and so that the next generation, which would be you all, could hopefully have as many opportunities as our generation, although I think I'm older than you, but that's okay. Anyhow, as far as his background goes, he's was founder of an ecological center in the Baltic Sea in Sweden. He lived in Sweden for how many years?
5 years in Sweden, 5 years in Norway.
5 years in Sweden and 5 years in Norway. I'm assuming everybody knows where those two countries are. And that was, it was an energy related. And then he also has 2 radio shows on WDEV, the local Waterbury show. That one is Mondays, and Thursdays, WGDR, which is out of Goddard in Goddard's Montpelier or East Montpelier.
Or Plainfield or something.
Or Plainfield or somewhere around there. And there's a news station that's just been added on, which is for the Hardwick area. And his programs really all deal with food, energy, and the local economy at the age of the end of oil. He also has been working with Transition Town. How many people have heard of Transition Town? Okay, it's a, well, great. It's a very localized movement helping communities look at themselves and figure out how they're going to be managing after when there is the end of oil, and really banking on community resilience, which is communities, our communities, whether it's your community here in this school or in this classroom or in your town, you know, we have lots of things that we can depend on and accomplish things with. So Carl's going to be asking questions, telling you some information, really good notes. And I'm going to be a scribe.
Okay, and one more time, remind me when this period ends, so I know when to wrap things up.
48.
9:48? Okay.
9:48.
Thank you.
There we go.
Kore wa nan desu ka? Kore wa nan desu ka?
See.
See. Good. When people don't understand you, because they speak a different language, then you should always speak louder and yell at them and speak more slowly, right? Didn't work all that well. I was asking you, what does this mean in Japanese? This is Japan in Japanese. When I was your age, I lived in Tokyo. Just for 5 months, my dad went over there to teach at a university, and he took the whole family along, and really opened my eyes to how different things can be in other parts of the world. So right now I'm following the events over in Japan, both with the tidal wave and the earthquake, plus the events at the Fukushima #1 nuclear plant, with a lot of personal feelings, because I know some people there, and I know what it's like to live there. And I'm very surprised, I guess as surprised as the Japanese are, at how quickly it can go from being a very well-ordered society where the trains run bing, right on time, and people have their secure houses to go to and their secure grocery stores to get their food at, and their water comes plumbing right into their homes, to one where 500,000 people are living in tents in weather like this outside, and a lot more are homeless and displaced. Now we have nearly 200,000 people who've been evacuated from the area around the nuclear plants, or they're sealed into their homes. They're told not to go outside, and put a wet towel underneath the doorway so that the air doesn't come in. Don't open your windows. It's a very sudden transition for them, and I feel it viscerally. So what I want to do in our time together here is, I have a little exercise prepared to help us think together about how important electricity from these nuclear reactors or other sources is to us us, how much it affects our lives, and we can get to that. But I'd like to begin by just checking in with you, how much you've been following the situation in Japan and what your thoughts are on that. And, you know, I'm a radio host, we can have an open-ended conversation about that for the entire time, if that seems to be where things are going, or we can leave that and go on to my exercise. Why don't I just stop there and see what input you have, the situation in Japan, have you been following it? Yes, no?
Not really like following it, but I've seen like videos on YouTube and stuff.
What have you seen videos of?
Just like houses being like demolished and stuff, and the nuclear plant, and the tsunami, like the actual like wave,
Yeah.
and not much about the earthquake really though. The tsunami seems to be like a bigger thing on YouTube than the earthquake itself.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I don't really know much about it, I guess, but I've definitely seen a bunch of videos about it.
Seen the explosions at the nuclear plants on YouTube?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that the same like nuclear plants that blew up is the people that made those are the same people that made Vermont Yankee? Like,
Yeah, the ones, all 5 of them, all 6 of them at the Fukushima #1 plant are the General Electric Mark I nuclear reactors that were designed in the 1960s, built in the 60s and 70s, and it's the same age pretty much as the Vermont Yankee plant and pretty much the same design, yeah. And what some people have been talking about for years, but we've seen more publicity about recently, is that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or its predecessor, had a different name back then in this country, but the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission was raising questions back in the 70s about how safe these reactors were because of their design. They were designed to be smaller and lighter than the previous generation of reactors, and what does that mean in terms of costs of making them, do you think?
less?
Yeah, and that means more profits. So they were designed to be smaller and lighter, and that means a little bit less containment security, possibly. Containment of any possible nuclear radiation in case of an accident. Other reactions, I think you were indicating you've been following it?
I see it a little like on Yahoo and stuff like that. They just have a lot of pictures of people trying to evacuate or being tested to see if they have any nuclear radiation on them and stuff like that. I think it's a lot of worry about families and little kids and stuff like that, especially because you can't tell whether or not you've been poisoned.
Yeah.
So that's mainly what I've seen.
Right. You can't tell whether you've been poisoned. Some people, I mean, if it's really acute radiation poisoning, you can get burns, or nausea, things like that. But you can get radiation on you and have cancer develop years later, and not even know whether it came from that particular exposure or from something else. There's also a danger that the spent fuel storage in these reactors, which has gotten less attention in the news that I've been following than the fires, the explosions, and the meltdowns. There's partial meltdowns of the fuel in 2 or 3 of the reactors, but there's spent fuel storage in giant swimming pools, basically up on the roof of the reactors. That's the same design they have down in Vernon at Vermont Yankee. The spent fuel is kept on the roof. And that water needs to be there to keep the fuel from starting on fire, because if it's not cooled constantly, it will get too hot and start on fire. And if it's up on the roof and the pool has been damaged there and there's a crack in it and the water's running out, they need to get new water in there. Or if it just boils away, they need to get new water in there. And the problems came about in the first place because they lost the electricity that ran the plant. So I don't know how they're doing that in terms of keeping the pools filled. But those that spent fuel, as I understand it, is these reactors are part of a class of reactors that use something called MOX. The important thing about MOX is it contains plutonium.
Is that MOX?
MOX, capital M, capital O, capital X.
Okay.
Plutonium is so poisonous that if it's dispersed right, a couple pounds are enough to kill everybody on the planet. It has to be dispersed very evenly, very fine particles, but just plutonium when you breathe in, it can kill you. So if that starts on fire and gets spread through the smoke, then a lot of people can be poisoned. So we don't know what's gonna happen there. They've made the decision in Japan, as we have in the US, to become highly dependent on nuclear power. They use a lot less electricity than we do. The numbers are 8.5 megawatt hours per person each year. So 8.5 megawatt hours, we talk about kilowatt hours here. What's the relationship between kilowatt hours and megawatt hours? Anybody know that, can guess it? Yeah.
Well, it's just like a bigger amount, like 1 to 1,000.
Right, it's, mega means million in the metric system, so, kilowatt, is 1,000, so, 8,500 kilowatt hours, you could say. In the US, we use 14.2 megawatt hours per year, so we use a fair amount more than they do, but,
Are we like a lot bigger though? Or like,
no, this is per person.
okay,
Good
that's
question.
less.
Yeah, so per person, we use a lot more. They get a bigger percentage of their electricity from nuclear than we do. They have almost half as many nuclear reactors as the US, they have 55, the US has 104. They get 25% of their electricity from nuclear, we get just under 20%. Like Vermont,
How many percent?
they get 25, we get 20.
Okay.
Like Vermont, Japan is lacking in non-renewable energy resources. Here the sun shines, not today, but sometimes. Sun shines, the wind blows, the water flows, but we don't have coal, we don't have oil, we don't have natural gas, we don't have geothermal even. Or if we do, it's miles down below the surface. Japan's the same way, they've got some coal, but pretty much otherwise they're lacking in resources. And that's why World War II started between the US and Japan, by the way. Did you know that Pearl Harbor was a result of an energy crisis in Japan?
And that's something I didn't even know, you were telling me on the way down in the car.
Yeah, Japan was in the 1930s invading China, invading other parts of Southeast Asia. They were starting wars, and the US didn't like to see this happen, but the US wasn't ready to go to war against Japan to stop them from these wars. So they said, well, look, these guys don't have any oil of their own, but in the Dutch East Indies, which we call Indonesia these days, there's a lot of oil. And they're getting their oil from the Dutch East Indies. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna put a naval blockade in. We're gonna get our warships down there and not fight the Japanese, but we're gonna keep them from going to what's now Indonesia and bringing oil back to Japan so they can fuel their home economy and their war machine. And this was very effective. After about a year, the Japanese were on their knees. They had a fraction of the oil available to them that they did before, and they couldn't fight their wars as well. And the Japanese saw that this can't go on. So they decided they need to get through to Indonesia again, and the way to do that is to deliver a death blow to the US Pacific Fleet. So they figured they'd find them concentrated in Pearl Harbor, in the harbor there, go in with a surprise attack from 6 aircraft carriers, just wipe out US forces, and then have enough time to consolidate their military while the US was building back up, that the US wouldn't dare to attack them again. Well, it didn't work out that way. Some of the main carriers that they were trying to attack were at sea and not in Pearl Harbor at the time, and turns out that the US is a country with a lot of energy resources of its own and a big amount of will, big manufacturing capability, untouched by war, and so those ships were put back together. Many of them were put back together fairly quickly, new ships were manufactured, and Japan suffered a huge defeat, but it was all because of oil in the beginning. So oil has, and energy has a huge impact on international relations like that, and the way we live our daily lives. You've done some oral histories, I understand, with people who, were these people who were from around here who didn't have electricity when they grew up, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And what sort of changes did they report in their lives when electricity came?
Well, I think there was a lot of, they were able to do more things easier,
Like what?
foods would definitely, you know, they were able to refrigerate food and keep it longer.
Right.
Plus then there's also, different electronics started coming out that were, much different from what they were used to.
Okay.
They didn't have to like carry around like lanterns and stuff all the time.
So they went from lanterns to
The lights.
lights that they
Yeah.
just flipped on, yeah. They talk about indoor air quality? Yeah.
It made it so that they could like do more work because they had more time to do it.
Because the lights were on,
Yeah.
yeah. They talk about indoor air quality, about how kerosene lanterns weren't burning and got better air.
That just makes me think of when we did the fishbowl. I think one of the people, and I'm not sure which class it was, but she said that she could remember, talking about it, she could smell the kerosene lantern. Cause we had that lantern on the center of the table, and it was lit, but it was odorless
Right.
stuff, but, that was what she remembered
Ah.
so distinctly.
Speaking of indoor air quality, can I ask you to put the cap on that, marker?
Sure, sorry, are these, okay.
I find, I'm bothered by the fumes from the
Oh,
fireworks.
I'm sorry, then we're in trouble.
Yeah, as long as you're using it, it's fine.
Okay.
It's like turning off the lights when you leave a room. Not
Yeah,
using it,
yeah.
turn them off. As I said, I do a couple radio shows, and they're about energy, food, and the local economy at the end of the age of oil. And I like to just give a different perspective on things, and I'm wondering, in these recordings you have of these oral histories, are you editing them? Are you putting them together in a way that you're gonna present to each other and that I could use on the radio? What are you planning to do with them?
We turn them into Mr. B, and then I think, there's some place that might be presented. Those are a select few, I think, was the plan.
Okay, to go to the Vermont Folklife Center.
Yeah, I think that was the plan.
Okay, so what would be the best way for me to get them? Talk to Mr. B?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. So, any other questions or comments on the situation in Japan?
I'm wondering, has anybody, I guess my question is, the meltdown versus just, sort of out of control.
Wait, what
Versus
caused
this.
the explosion at the
Okay.
at the nuclear plant?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it was a chemical explosion, it wasn't a nuclear explosion. And it was caused by hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is highly explosive. Have you seen the pictures of the Hindenburg blowing up? It was filled with hydrogen.
Who doesn't know what the Hindenburg is?
It's a
giant
Okay.
blimp,
Can somebody else tell them what it was?
Yeah, go ahead.
a giant blimp that suddenly caught on fire up in the air and was down in like, I don't know how long.
Couple
seconds.
minutes,
Yeah.
yeah. It had flown over it was an airship, it was an alternative to jets, before jets were invented. And it had flown over the Atlantic Ocean, and as it was being tied up here, it started on fire and came crashing to the ground. So hydrogen is highly explosive, and I've seen different pieces of information, but the most consistent that I see is that the hydrogen is coming from the water that's being used in cooling. Once these fuel rods just start overheating on their own, they can get up to 2,000 degrees. And then the next jump, when they're really overheating, is 4,000 degrees, and they just melt apart completely.
Is that Fahrenheit or centigrade?
I've seen it in the US, so it's probably Fahrenheit, but
Okay.
these numbers, doesn't matter, it's really, really, really
It's
hot.
hot.
Hotter than anything that we've experienced, anything we can get our ovens to be, it's really hot. And when you make water, hundreds of degrees hot, then it boils. But when you make it thousands of degrees hot, then water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, and it just rips the molecules apart. So you've got hydrogen, which is flammable when combined with oxygen, you got all that oxygen right there, plus it's mixed in with the regular atmosphere. It just takes a spark. It's like having gasoline fumes, it just takes a spark to cause an explosion. So at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, they were worried about the same thing. I recall that there's as a nuclear plant meltdown in 1979, when I
Was it
in,
79?
when I was in Japan, oddly enough.
Oh, wow, okay. Has anybody heard about that one? Three Mile Island was in Pennsylvania.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, capital Pennsylvania.
Right, and there was, so I heard somebody on the radio say today there were similarities with what's going on in Japan in that there was a delay. But they didn't have an earthquake and they didn't have a tsunami.
They-
But there
they
was a
just had
delay
people
in saying-
who didn't know what they were doing, fooling
Yeah.
around with the reactor controls.
Right, and it really ended up being a relative disaster, but it was contained.
More or
but
less, yeah.
More or less,
Mm.
some places less.
So those are, so that's where the explosions have come from. And what the explosions have done is blow away some of the buildings there, but the people say the real containment is provided by the reactor vessels. The buildings enclose the reactor vessels, and those have, they say, not been damaged by the explosions except for the most recent one, or maybe it was the next most recent one. That one apparently did damage a reactor vessel, and there is a somewhat uncontrolled release of radiation.
Reactor
Right.
vessel versus the building,
Yeah,
the outer building. So the reactor vessel is where the nuclear rods are that have to be kept under water
yeah.
to contain the radiation. So they're saying there might be damage to that
To one of the,
core part.
out of the six at the Fukushima #1 plant.
I don't think I spelled it right. No, I didn't. Not even
Fuku,
close.
F-U-K-U,
No,
S-H,
it's
I- F-U-K-U.
okay. Keep going.
It's almost something that we can't print on the board here, F-U-K-U. S-H-I-M-A, Fukushima. And they call it Fukushima Daiichi, but you don't have to worry about Daiichi, that's just Japanese for #1.
Oh, see, we've learned two words in Japanese.
Anything else on that?
Seriously, if you've got any questions about this, he knows a lot.
Well, wasn't it built on a fault line?
Basically, all of Japan is a fault line or close to a fault line. It's part of the Pacific Ring of Fire that arches around through the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, comes back down the Canadian coast, includes San Francisco, down to Los Angeles. So, yeah, they knew that this plant was gonna experience an earthquake. They knew that this plant was gonna experience a tidal wave, a tsunami, as we call it these days. So that has nothing to do with tides, it's triggered by earthquakes. And they even put up a seawall to contain the tidal wave. But this earthquake at magnitude 9 was a lot bigger than the design earthquake, which was 7.5, 7.8. So it was like 15 times bigger than the earthquake they expected there, but they knew there was gonna be something.
So other than the seawall, did they design the plant more for earthquakes and tsunamis than they did say Vermont Yankee, other than the seawall?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I can take a look for that and get some information back to Mr. B on that. I haven't heard that they did. I know out in California, they built the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. Turns out right over a fault line, which is not good, 'cause
Did they know that?
they found out more about faults as they were constructing it. When they originally designed it, they knew they were in an earthquake-prone zone. They didn't know they were right over a fault line.
Okay.
And they built in some special seismic provisions. I don't know what they are, but in skyscrapers, they have something like the suspension in a car, so that it's basically on springs, and it gives it a little bit of flexibility to rock back and forth from the earthquakes. I haven't heard that they did that in these nuclear plants, but they might have. Unfortunately, in Diablo Canyon, after they had them built, then a newly on the job 25-year-old engineer was looking at the plans and saying, hey, these are reversed, these are mirror image plans. So they had put the seismic cushioning in the wrong place, because they were working with a mirror image of what the reactor really was, or what the seismic design needed to be.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know what they've done since.
Young people can come up with amazing things.
Well, it's having fresh eyes.
Yeah.
The Zen mind, the beginner mind, you come to
Yeah.
a new task without all the expectations that people doing the task before have, and you see things with fresh eyes, and all of a sudden, you discover things that nobody else has seen before. I was reading recently about, totally off subject, but it's important
okay.
for,
Do we want to go off subject?
it's important for people your age to realize how powerful you are coming with your beginner minds to a lot of subjects. A guy was teaching piano, very proficient piano teacher, and there's a piece that is not performed all that often, but dozens at least of very skilled pianists all over the world have performed it, and this student made a mistake, and the teacher heard the mistake and said, no, that's not how it is. Play it the way it's written. And she said, I did play it the way it's written. See, there's that note right there. And on his score and on her score, her sheet music, it was the same mistake. And every place else they looked, the sheet music, it was the same mistake. All these other pianists had played it correctly, not played this mistake, because they knew in their mind what music is supposed to sound like, what this particular piece was supposed to sound like, and so they just skipped right over the mistake. So in this case, it wasn't so bad that their experienced minds missed the mistake, because they could make it right. But if it's a nuclear power plant design, you want somebody who is able to find the mistake.
That's mainly why I don't read drum charts when I play the drums.
Yeah, because you feel it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never read my music ever.
right? Some of the best musicians around that have never learned to read music.
Like I can read, but I just don't like. I'm not like. I don't have my head like in the chart the whole entire time.
You
There's
really-
some musicians that do that, and it's just stupid. Doesn't sound like as good after.
So you're doing it by ear.
Yeah.
So you're using another sense to
Yeah.
make it happen.
Okay, well, let's give one more round of opportunities for questions, comments on the situation in Japan, and then we'll move into an abbreviated version of our exercise.
Anybody? What recommendation do you have for, let's say, a news station to check things out, let's say on television about the Japanese?
For a news station to?
Yeah, for them
in
to-
reporting?
Yeah.
A place to go?
Check it, yeah, to go and check in as to what's going on.
The Union of Concerned Scientists has a website called All Things Nuclear, and I think it's .org. But if it's not .org, you type in All Things Nuclear to search engine, you'll come across it. They have very sober-minded and realistic assessments. Hey, you gonna leave just when we're starting the exercise?
He has a meeting.
You do, okay.
Okay,
Yeah, so that's a pretty good site, and they have
Union
links.
of,
Union of Concerned Scientists. And they are, I believe they are a pro-nuclear organization because of climate change. They wanna see more nuclear reactors as a way of combating climate change. But they also are very concerned about nuclear safety. And often in this debate, people who are concerned about nuclear safety are labeled anti-nuclear. Our own nuclear expert in this state, Arnie Gunderson, who's worked in the industry for 4 decades, is pretty unhappy about being labeled anti-nuclear just because he wants to see these plants operated safely or closed down. They can't be operated safely.
and nuclear plants are considered carbon neutral by many, but there is another aspect to that, which is how do you harvest the uranium, which is what you need to have the nuclear plant function. And most of where we get it, the uranium from is up in Canada, am I correct?
That's my understanding, but I haven't looked
Okay,
into it.
and that's, it's a huge mining operation that has a big carbon footprint, as well as there's a lot of destruction going on for, the habitat, the area for the indigenous people that live up there, and let's say have hunted and fished and whatever in all their waters, and a lot of that is really being altered by this harvesting or mining of the uranium. So might be something you might wanna check out, just on the internet.
Well, in Tokyo, which was hit by the earthquake, but was able to withstand it pretty well, they're getting rolling blackouts. 3 hours a day, their electricity is going out. And in one sector of town, it will happen for 3 hours, and then they'll get their lights back on for the rest of the day, and 3 hours of darkness somewhere else. Because they don't have enough electricity to go around with all these nuclear power plants shut down. And in Vermont, we can also experience a loss of electricity for weeks at a time, actually. The 1998 ice storm, parts of Quebec had 4 to 6 weeks of blackouts. And just, I think it was last winter, actually, they had ice storms not far from here in New Hampshire, where people for a week or more had no electricity. So I want you to think about how you use electricity in your home right now, and what people used to do, you've learned from the oral histories, before they had electricity, and what you have around your home right now. We don't have too much time for this, so I'll just ask you to sit for yourself, each person by yourself, and for a couple minutes, think if we had an ice storm that came in, say it knocked out transportation for a couple days because of all the snow. So trucks couldn't get in with new food, you couldn't get out to the store to get anything off the shelves for a couple days. And say you're without electricity for 3 weeks, what are you going to do for light after dark? This is gonna happen in January. And what are you going to do for heat? And remember, if you have an oil furnace or a boiler, a propane furnace or a boiler, if you have a wood pellet stove, those all rely on electricity to operate. So what are you gonna do to keep warm? And I want you to think outside the box of your house and think about, maybe you have a wood stove, and that's great, but maybe you don't have a wood stove. Do you have any neighbors who have a wood stove who you could move in with for a while? Is there a school that you could go to, or a hospital, or some other public building? Like in East Montpelier, there's a wood stove at one of the churches. Could a lot of people move into the church for a few weeks just to keep warm during a crisis like this? So, yeah, a couple questions.
When was the last time there had been blackouts like in Vermont, like specifically Vermont, not like Canada or?
New Hampshire is very close to Vermont, and
But
yeah, I think the 98 ice storm in the southern part of the state knocked out power for a while. I think that was a time that Marlborough College was out of electricity and isolated from the rest of the world. And their digital phone system didn't allow people to call in or call out. Either people's cell phones ran down. That might have been a little bit later even. Burlington was pretty hard hit by the ice storm, and transformers exploding and all sorts of things. I don't know how long the blackout was. Yeah.
If there's no transportation, can we still walk to the store? Like it's only
That,
like
yeah, that's a good question. You live close to the store?
I live about like there's like one store like a mile away, and then there's another one like 3 miles away.
Okay, well, it's pretty hard to get through with all the snow and ice, but if you have snowshoes and crampons, then
I also have a snowmobile, so I can.
I'll let you walk to the store if you, and think about whether anybody's gonna be there.
Well, I mean, they don't have to be there for me to get stuff.
Oh, really? What are the implications of that?
That's a point. Yeah, one more question and then.
No, I was gonna comment on how there probably wouldn't have been anybody at the store to help you get.
Unless it's one of those stores that people live right there, right.
Yeah.
And you can.
Maybe.
Right.
Okay, one more question and then let's go.
What if you have a generator at your house?
Then write about that. And how much fuel do you have on hand to run it for how long? So why don't you just take 2 minutes to think about what you're gonna do just for light and heat.
Yeah.
For 3 weeks without electricity, couple days without being able to get out on the roads with cars.
Okay, so, go with your list.